welcome to our second webinar. Hope you are all doing well despite the current events in South Africa. Di will be talking a little bit more about it just before our presentation starts. If you are new to the webinar series and you missed our first webinar, it is available on our YouTube channel. Alternatively, we can send you the link via email. My email address is on the slideshow at the end of the presentation. So if you need it, please just let me know. Today, Di will be speaking about wills and estates and how important it is to make sure that your estate is structured properly. We hope that you enjoy today and find it very interesting. As mentioned, if you have any questions, our contact details are at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to email us or give us a call. I'm now going to hand over to Di, who will start the presentation for you. Enjoy.
Morning, everybody. I've always wanted to look like I was invisible and walking through a wall, but the best I could do was to walk through the structure behind me. So that is just as an introduction to where we are. We're at my house and we're all locked down and working from home, but that makes no difference to you as our clients and friends, relations, etc. And thank you for joining us. Before we start on generational wealth and what we actually want to talk to you about, I think it's very important just to give you a sense of our thoughts on what's been happening. And I'm sure we are all concerned about current events. And in particular, I think it's made a lot of us very sad that our nation is in the state that it's in. But just to give you some kind of context, I don't know if you remember about a year ago, we had Graham Codrington, who did a presentation for us actually on COVID and the pandemic and his assessment of how it was going to roll out, which has been excellent and certainly prepared us to some extent for what happened. And he's written a comment that I got just before the webinar starts, and I'd like to read parts of it to you. To my South African friends who fear the sky is falling on our heads today, I don't know if this will help you, but last night, so you wrote this yesterday, 2 Italians were stabbed and many others injured by unruly hooligan English football fans in England. On 6th of January, a rioting mob stormed the US Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Outside, they erected a gallows and possibly would have hung the vice president on it if they had found him. The president of Haiti was assassinated last week. Remember Israel and Palestine just a few weeks ago? Have you been following what's happening in Ethiopia, Mozambique, Eswatini, and northern Nigeria? A few years ago, when the ex-president of Brazil was jailed for corruption, there were riots across the country. Let's not even start to talk of India, China, and Russia and the violence in those countries and other BRICS. South Africa is part of a global story of the final days of a political and economic era. These seismic shifts do not happen peacefully, sadly, and there is understandable pent-up anger and frustration in large parts of our society. South Africa is not alone in going through these change convulsions. Let's hope that we can restore calm quickly, but let's hope even more that we can bring about deep, lasting, and meaningful change for everyone. I, that's Graham Codrington, remain hopeful that what we are experiencing now will lead to a brighter future that we will build together, not just in South Africa, but across the whole world. And I think that helps to put what has happened and is unfolding into context. From the point of view of your portfolios, for those of you who are clients of ours, we are obviously watching them very closely, and in particular the local market. But we're not panicking, we're keeping calm, and we have learned that one sits on one hands and watches and makes sensible decisions rather than panicking into decisions. You will have noticed that the rand has weakened, but it's not dramatic. And we must remember that what's unfolding is not an international event, which is what usually makes a rand blowout like it has. And we will continue to invest as we always have. We're very well positioned in that over the last few years, we have been moving your funds offshore. And on average, for all of you, you have exposure of 75% offshore and 25% local, if we've been able to do it for you. And just to reassure you that your assets are safe. They are not under threat. And we will be watching carefully to make sure that if we think the threats are increasing, we will position you to cope with that. If you do want to chat to us, please let us know. We are obviously available to talk to any of you at any stage of the day or night. Since we're all working from home, here we are. And you're welcome to address us and share your concerns with us. So moving on from that, let's take 45 minutes, I think is how long this is going to take. Let's not look at what's going on with the looting and maybe just put your phones aside for that 45-minute period and concentrate on something else that I hope is going to be of great interest to you. Kate, why have I got your name in my little block? Sorry, I seem to have disappeared from the screen. There we are. So what I wanted to address, first of all, is an apology to all our clients who are watching the last webinar, who are pre-baby boomers, because I made the mistake of not mentioning the silent generation. And the silent generation are the generation above the baby boomers. And to all our silent generation clients, I do apologize. You are just as important as everybody else. And you are included in this webinar, you will see. And thank you for bearing with us, considering the mistake I made. What's important about all of you silent generation is you're about 80, maybe a bit younger. You've retired mostly. And your characteristics of your generation is you're the generation that is seen and not heard. So as children, that was what you were told. You also lived through a lot of hardship, World War II, and some of you the Great Depression. So you're very prudent. Waste not, want not is a motto of yours. You're traditionalist, as it were, and you tend to do the right thing, which makes you quite responsible, hardworking, conscientious. And that's just to give you a bit of background as to how you fit in. So moving on, we're now going to start the webinar. We're going to take you on a journey. I'm going to explain wills and estates in very high level terms, and we're going to take you through the generations and what affects each of them. So come with us on the journey. We're about to begin. So what is your estate? On the left-hand side of your screen, you've got a box that says anything you own in your own name is what is in your estate. Whether you're dead or alive, there is an estate as long as you own assets. What will also fall into that is any debt that you might have. On the right-hand side, we've got things that are not in your estate, and this is a very, very important distinction. There are certain assets that are not included under your estate, and those are assets that are in a trust. Your spouse's assets may or may not be part of your estate, and I'll go into that a bit later. And a lot of you may have retirement products, living annuities, retirement annuities, etc. Those are not in your estates. There are other things, but that's just a very broad overview. So just bear in mind that as you go through life, anything in your own name is your estate. We're now going to move on to wills. So Wills are a very important part of your lives, and one hopes you don't need them for a very, very long time, but they do need to be part of your planning. And when do you need a will? You need a will when you have assets, when you have anything in your own name, and when you have those important people in your life. Up until then, it doesn't really matter, and it's not really going to be of any value. But when those two things start to happen, you need a will. And why do you need the will? You need it to leave the assets that you accumulate as you see fit to the important people that you choose to leave them to. And the very, very important thing is, please do not die intestate. I will explain what that means, but it basically means you don't have a will. And there are consequences to that, which we will discuss. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move through the generations, and you will see how each of them relate to what I've just mentioned. Just remember those two things. You have an estate and there are wills. So we start with our tiny tots. There they are, Joe and Jane Soap. They're Generation Alpha, so they've either just been born or they're not much older than about 10 or 11. And what's important here is they are still in their childhood years. And it says here they could be teenagers or could be students, so they've grown up a bit. And their estates are small or non-existent. Your children really don't have assets in their own name. Their parents are in their 30s to 40s, so that to a large extent is our millennials, and they have no dependents of their own. They have no assets. They are still minors, but often they may be beneficiaries of trusts. So just bear that particular aspect in mind, and they do not need a will. So there is no will in place, and I'm sure you can all relate to that. That makes sense. We then move on. So there's no estate duty, there's no estate, so there's no estate duty. We then move on to Generation Z and the Zoomers. And where they are is they grow up and they go to university or college, and that's where they probably are at the moment. They meet each other and look at those lovely hearts there. Joe and Jane have now fallen in love. And that's the beginning, hopefully, of a long relationship, but with lots of estate complications. And they graduate and they each get a job. But Joe and Jane do not have wills, and they are going to die intestate. This means that their estates will be divided amongst their surviving spouse, but remember, they don't have a spouse, they're not married. They don't have children, they have parents and siblings, and that is how, if you die intestate, the rule of law decides how your assets are going to be split up. So what's going to happen is poor old Jane is living with Joe in his flat. But if Joe dies, that flat's going to be inherited by his parents, 50% each. And you can see here we've done a very simple calculation, and I hope it's big enough on your screens, but it doesn't really matter too much. Please don't worry about the detail of these slides. It's really to take you through the idea rather than concentrate on the details that there are. So Joe's estate, you can see there, he's got a car, a flat, and a bank account, and it amounts to 1.25 million. And Joe's parents are each going to inherit 625,000 because he did not have a will leaving anything to Jane. She's got a car and a bank account, and her parents will inherit half each if she dies. What I need to bring in now is just to let you know, when somebody dies, you do get what's called in South Africa an estate duty exemption amount of 3.5 million rand. If your estate is below 3.5 million rand, like Joe's and Jane's, there is no estate duty. So they then grow up and they become millennials or Generation X. and what happens to them at this stage of their lives. And we've tried to relate it to what's going on in most of your lives, depending on what age you are. And if you look at the top there, look at that. There are rings, which means that they've got married. So Joe and Jane are now married, and they now have a marital contract. Please remember that. It's very important for all of you. And there you get different types of marriage contracts. Their contract is out of community of property, which means that they don't own things together, but it includes the accrual system. And now they've got children. So I just want to go into the marital contract in a little bit more detail, because what this means, and this is the default that applies if you're not married in community of property, you will have this contract in place if you did not specify anything else. You will be married out of community of property, and it will include the accrual system, which means that everything from the day you get married is basically forms part of your joint estates. You can exclude things from it, and that's what happens in the contract. But basically, everything that you accumulate between the two of you belongs to both of you and is split 2 ways, half each. Why this is so important is because when one of you dies, the other one has a claim of whatever that accrual amount is against the estate of the one who's died. And what tends to happen is people don't take this into account, and you assume you're leaving assets to whoever it is in certain amounts, and it's not actually correct. So you have to understand how you're married and how it affects your estates when you die. And now they've got children, little darlings, that are growing up in their household. So what do their assets look like now at this stage of their lives? Is everybody hearing me, by the way? Okay. And you can see there we've split them up. As I said, please don't worry about the detail. But Joe is a very successful businessman. I think he's in robotics and AI, so he's going to make a lot of money through life. Jane is an attorney, and she specializes in conveyancing, and so she earns a good, steady income, but she's not taking the risk that Joe is. So she, over time, will not make as much money as him, but the two of them, remember, are married, so it all counts towards their joint estates. You will also see that they've now got a property, and that's valued at 5 million rand. It's in their joint name, so it's split between the two of them in their estates. They've also been set upon by an insurance salesman who's persuaded them that it's a very good idea to have a retirement annuity because it's going to save them tax. And so they've both taken out a retirement annuity and they contribute to it monthly. Retirement annuities do have benefits, but they've got to benefit you. And I've noticed that when young professionals come into the market, they are immediately approached by somebody to say, you must have a retirement annuity. Please do the sums and how it affects you in particular before you accept that advice. It may be good, it may be bad, but you need to understand how they work, and we can obviously tell you how they work. They've also decided to put money into an endowment. So I'm listing here products that people usually invest in. And you will recognize some of the names. You may not recognize some of them, and we can guide you through all of that. Endowments do have certain tax advantages. And Jane has got a share portfolio. She's decided to put her money into equities. And so she's got shares like British American Tobacco, Billiton, NASPAS she would have, of course, etc., etc. Joe has decided to invest in his company, so he's got shares in the company, and at the moment they're valued at 5 million rand. And because they've got a house, they've taken out life insurance. And you will see that they've got a bond at the bottom of the page, which is what usually happens at this stage in life. And they've taken out a bond to be able to fund their lifestyle in the house that they want to live in. Joe now has 13 million rand in assets and Jane has 5. Total is 18 million rand. Please note that because they are married, and remember I mentioned that there's an estate duty exemption of 3.5 million rand for each of them when they die, that's not subject to tax, that you can add those two 3.5 millions together. So between them, before estate duty applies, which we'll take you into the calculation later on, they can have assets of 7 million before any estate duty kicks in. Just the very simple explanation of estate duty, any assets over 3.5 million or 7 million if you're married are subject to 20% estate duty. Have you all got that? Any amounts in your estate, if your estate's over 30 million rand, the estate duty is 25%. So those are quite hefty sums that are going to come off your estates if and when you die, and you've got a lot of assets in your own name. Names are. So they have wills and they've left their estates to each other. Don't worry about it at the moment. It will kick in later on when we show you the estate duty calculation. And we move on to our Generation X. And what's happening to them? Well, they've got to a stage of life now where unfortunately their parents have got rather old and they've moved on, and Joe and Jane start to inherit wealth from their families. Their asset base is now significant, so their estates are significant. So our estate duty is climbing all the time. And please bear in mind that before estate duty gets paid, capital gains tax gets paid. You can see this is concentrating to a large extent on tax because it is what's important, or it is what's going to make your estates reduce. And remember, primarily, once you die, it's your children who are inheriting, and you want them to inherit as much as possible. So what we're looking at here is their estates now. Gosh, they've gone up from 18 million rand. You can see that red block. Please look at the red block. We've got Joe and Jane's assets now in the red block. And if you look at the bottom line, it says net assets. Their net assets have now risen to 53 million rand. And what's happened is they've now introduced, because they're making so much money out of Joe's AI business, et cetera, and Jane's contributing nicely to the family coffers, you will see they've started an offshore trust, and they've got a local family trust. A lot of the money in these two pots has come from their families, who, unfortunately, their parents have died, if you remember, I told you that. So if we look at the red block, please go back to the red block, you will see that Joe's company is now worth a lot more, and they bought a new house. Their RAs have gone up. So their assets are increasing at quite a rapid pace. And it is what happens in life, especially at this stage of life, because you start to accumulate assets. In terms of the offshore trust block, which I'm not concentrating on this presentation, exchange control has been relaxing over the years at quite a rate. And there is opportunity to hold funds offshore, and it's easy to do. So if you need advice on not necessarily offshore trust, but on assets offshore, how to get the assets offshore, we understand how that works and we can certainly help you. But anyway, here they are. They're now making a lot of money. Again, they've left everything to each other. In a will, you can leave assets to whoever, you can leave your estate to whoever you want to leave it to. But for the purposes of this presentation, which is very high level, they've left it to each other, and you'll see why later on. So then Generation X grows up and they enter the baby boomer phase. Baby boomer phase is our second last phase. And Joe and Jane Soap's children have now grown up, and they are adults. And they become grandparents. That's why you've got a tiny tot holding Joe's hand there. their children and grandchildren have emigrated, which won't surprise any of you, because that's what happens, particularly when you live in South Africa. So we now have clients who have children all over the world. A lot of them in the UK, a lot are actually in Australia. There are some in Europe, some of them go to the US. You know, you've got the children, you know where they've gone. And unfortunately, it complicates everything. But I think the biggest tip here for you and your children is if they've left South Africa and in the past they had to emigrate, that's now changed, and I'll explain that a bit in a minute. But they have to emigrate. Immigration used to mean they had to submit a return to the Reserve Bank and financially emigrate, they used to call it, which is a bit of a misnomer, but that's how everybody knows it. On the 1st of March, that changed. And now what you have to get in order to be stamped as non-resident in South Africa, i.e. you've emigrated, is you have to get tax clearance and submit a last tax return to the receiver of revenue to prove that you are non-resident in South Africa, and then you're assumed that it's assumed that you've emigrated. So the process is simpler. It's very new. We're only doing our first few now, and we'll understand in a couple of months better how it works. But please, please tell your children, or if your children are about to leave, they must get that tax clearance. It's vital, because if they don't, the money that you leave to them will not get to them very easily. It will be blocked. Those are the rules at the moment, and we have to watch them because they change all the time. So that's on immigration. It's very important to understand. It's my cursor now. It's very important to understand where your children are. Where they go also determines how your assets would be structured. Australia has different rules. On the UK, to trust, you have different rules. To the US, it's complicated. And that's why it's important for us to understand if your kids go anywhere, where they go, so we can structure effectively. So then we've got their assets now, and look at that. They've gone from 50-something million up to 96 million in their own names. Look at the red block again. And I think the important thing here is that the offshore trust has also grown amazingly, and so has a local family trust. Unfortunately, their holiday home has not increased in value. It's still at 3 million rand because it's, we know where it's invested. And so it's quite important that you know what you're doing when you come to property. Where do you want it? I think over the last 5 years, property in South Africa has hardly increased in value. So one needs to determine how much you want in property and how much you don't want in property. So that's that portfolio. So they've retired. They've now retired. And Joe's decided to keep the shares in his company. You can see there his shares have now gone up to 40 million rand. And he's keeping the shares in the company because they're paying dividends to him and they're using that to live on. But at some point, he's going to have to sell his company. He's getting too old. So I think those were the most important points there. Kate, is there anything else you want me to mention? So we move on. Here you are, guys. We are moving on. They've got wills, but you can see they've left it to each other. Here's your silent generation. I hope all my silent generationers are watching. And they are now in a very interesting stage of life because they're enjoying their golden years. And they've made their capital and they're starting to use it up. Unfortunately, in this example, Jane passes away before Joe. So what have they got? You can still see they've got substantial assets in their name. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see that Joe's shares have now converted into cash of 40 million rand. Please note, I am not concentrating on companies, the capital gains tax effect of being invested in companies, how you get the money out of companies. That's a whole nother topic that we can cover if anybody wants us to. It's complicated, But obviously, every time you switch investments, there's capital gains tax to be paid. Please just bear that in mind. And in an estate, it's always charged before estate duty. So they've now started to use up their assets. And that's what they're doing over a period of time. But they are still worth 91 million in their own names, and they've got other assets. And I see, sorry, we've spelled offshore trust incorrectly. We'll correct that for the next webinar. And the total is 166 million rand that they've now accumulated. The figures are basically irrelevant. It's the principles that I'm trying to point out. So if you're at this age and you've got a different quantum of wealth, the same principles apply. It would just be a case of which ones we use for your particular set of circumstances. So what's very interesting is how the estate duty changes as you move from one set of wealth to another set of wealth as it gets accumulated. And you can see there, which is why I kept on banging on about estate duty, what the effect is of them holding all this money that they've got in their own names. So I think we must just stay on this slide for a little bit of time to look at what is important here. So as a millennial, because they've got assets of 18 million rand, your retirement benefits are always excluded from the estate duty calculation. So those are your pension funds, your provident funds, your preservation funds, your retirement annuities. They are not included in the estate duty calculation. Because they're married and they've left everything to each other, on the death of the last one, so remember Jane's died, and then Joe's going to die. When Joe dies, the 3.5 million rand estate duty exemption that was Jane's rolls over to him. And because he's inheriting all the assets, as it were, that 3.5 million becomes his 3.5 million. And on his death, 7 million rand is exempt from estate duty. So excluding retirement benefits and the estate duty exemption, their estate is now worth 9 million rand. Estate duty is at 20% for them. So 1.8 million is going to come off their estate. And you add back various bits and pieces. And of the 18 million, 16.5 million is going to be inherited by their heirs, whoever they might be. You then extrapolate that calculation to your Generation X, who were then worth 53 million, to your baby boomers, who were worth 96 million. And then your silent generation are starting to spend the money. So their assets have reduced down to 91 million. But their estate duty has gone up, as you can see there, because they've used their retirement benefits to draw down on. So not so much is excluded from the estate duty calculation. So you can see the effect here as you go through life of what happens if you don't plan or your planning is limited. And you land up paying these huge amounts of estate duty that your children are not going to inherit. So how do we mitigate for that? What if Joe and Jane's estates were structured differently? And what would we do to do that? So what we've got to do is we've got to take assets out of their own name. So here we are again. We've got our asset schedule. And what we've done, you'll see there are a lot of blanks in the middle there where there were amounts in before. And what we've done is we've moved the assets out of their own names and we've put them into either the offshore trust or the local family trust. And you can see there what the effect is we've then reduced, if you go down to the bottom where it says net assets, we've managed to reduce their estates down to 19 million, adding up in my head, sorry. But their total assets are still 166 million right on the right-hand side. And we've shifted most of the wealth offshore. So now they're living in South Africa, but they're really in a good position because they can draw from offshore and can just carry on living their lives here if that's what they want. So does this or doesn't this have an effect? And I just want to show you what the restructuring does in a chart. So the yellow or orange, whatever you want to call it, the yellow is their assets before the restructuring, and you can see how much was there in their own names, those yellow bands, as it were. And the red is if we had taken their assets and had planned it properly, they would now have far more sitting in trusts and far less sitting in their own names. And what we tend to see as people go through life is they either have different financial advisors or they get different advice from their friends or they inherit amounts they don't know what to do with. So you land up with a bit of a mishmash. And it's nice to sort out the mishmash before it starts. But because we're all living for so long now, I personally have come to the conclusion that one's usually got a lot of time to sort out the issues, even if you are a baby boomer. So if there are lots of baby boomers out there who think it's too late, please, please don't think that. There are things that we can do to help so that your children will be able to inherit more. Anyway, the crux of this whole thing is, coming on to the next slide, is what are Joe and Jane's estate duty figures going to be like if their estates were planned correctly? And there you have it. Look at that red line or that red writing. You can see that their estate duty, which would have been 17 plus million when they died, is now only 790,000 when they die as silent generation. That is the impact of estate planning. And how does that compare with what they would have paid? And there we've got it. That is the difference between planning and not planning. So we'd like to encourage you all to look at your estates. If you don't have a will, please, can we organize that for you? It really doesn't cost very much, and it is worth putting in place. A will is a document that changes all the time. And as one gets older, one tends to change it more often. It doesn't matter. It's just got to be what you want to do, how you want to leave things. If you have complicated structures and you have trusts and you have wills, please either let us or have a look at it. Your will and your trust structures, your trust legal document, the trust deed, have to be aligned. They have to talk to each other so that the one doesn't contradict the other. We can go into many, many, many examples of how this all fits together. I don't think it's appropriate now because we're going to run out of time. How long have I taken? Oh, okay, so last slide, here we go. To give you a little bit of detail on what happens on the process when somebody dies. And just so you know, unfortunately at the moment, and I think maybe one's much more aware of one's mortality because of the circumstances in which we live now. But it's hectic out there. And we recently have been dealing with clients who've died, unfortunately, because of COVID. And the crematoriums are really finding it difficult because there's such demand for their services. But that is where it all starts. is with the ceremony, getting hold of the funeral parlor, etc., when somebody dies. So somebody dies and everybody goes into panic because the estate gets frozen. Unfortunately, that is quite correct. The estate does get frozen, which means that you're not allowed to access any of the assets, any of the cash of the person who has died. And you need the death certificate before anything can unfold in terms of winding up the estate. Because remember, somebody's died now. There are a whole lot of assets that are sitting somewhere. Something's got to happen to them. They've got to be split up in terms of the will. How do you do that and who does that? And we're just going to run through that now. The first thing that has to happen is you have to get the death certificate. Home Affairs issues a death certificate. The death certificate is usually collected by the funeral parlor, so your AFBOB, your Thomas Kite, whoever it might be. And the next step is in your will. You will have appointed, because you have to, an executor. And what is the executor responsible for? The executor is responsible for winding up your estate. Your executor can be your spouse, it can be your children, it can be a professional. You can decide who you want as your executor. Please do not appoint a non-resident South African person as an executor. It makes it much too complicated. And that executor is then responsible for making sure that all those precious people you've left assets to get them. How are they going to do that? Well, they're going to appoint an administrator, because an administrator is the one who understands the process of winding up the estate. They are the ones, next thing, estate, how long is it frozen for? This is important. So an estate is frozen for as long as it takes to get what are called the letters of executorship. Now, how do you get the letters of executorship and who's involved? The administrator that you've appointed, who understands how this process unfolds, has to apply to the Master of the High Court for the letters of executorship. They do that, bearing in mind, remember, you or family or professional or the executor are appointed by the master to wind up the estate. And until those letters of executorship are issued, the estate is frozen. At the moment, letters of executorship after application are taking about 6 weeks. I'm looking at Kate in case you wonder what I'm doing. Takes about 6 weeks to be issued. So that's the length of time the estate is frozen for. Once the letters of executorship are issued, the administrator who you've appointed to wind up the estate can actually release funds. The executor gives the administrator power of attorney to wind up the estate. What the administrator then does, it gathers everything. There are lists that get sent to you, and it's the ID book, it's the credit cards, it's the bank statements, it's a medical aid card, etc., and all the assets as well. So all of that and the original will. Please, if you can't find your original will, you must let us know. You need to redo it because a copy is not accepted by the master. So you gather all of those documents together and they go to the administrator. And then the administrator has to find all the assets, which hopefully you've got track of, whoever you is as the executor. Very often, just so you know, we're the executor and we do know what the assets are. So then it's not too difficult. But if you've got pots sitting all over the place, it makes the job of the executor very difficult if they don't know. So what the administrator don't know where they are. So what the administrator then does is they then find all the assets and they use software to do it. Their programs, their search works, they're astute, and they basically search for your assets anywhere in the world. And they also look for any liabilities, so negatives in your estate, any bonds or money that you owe. And they put all of that together and they issue what's called a liquidation and distribution account. That goes to the master, and the estate is wound up and the assets are distributed to the heirs. This process takes, at the moment, because of the master's particular issues, anything from 2 to 3 years. So it's very important that if you have a spouse that you think does not have funds, that you either access the money from the estate once the letters of executorship have been issued, or they have money in their own name. Because it could be quite a long time, especially if the estate is complicated. Just in terms of wills, do you need an offshore will? Do you need a local will? How many wills do you need? It all depends on where your assets are. A South African will cover your worldwide assets, or if you have assets elsewhere, a South African will cover all your worldwide assets. Remember, all your assets, wherever they are, form part of your estate, and in South Africa, they are all subject to estate duty. If you have an asset in in another jurisdiction, you can have an offshore will if you've got a property somewhere else. But it's all quite case dependent. So if you have assets scattered all over the world, please let us know, because if there are different jurisdictions involved, you may need one for the US, you might need one for the UK, you might need one for Europe, or you might only need a South African one. It depends on what those assets are. So there are all sorts of tips and things that we've learned over the years. And I think what will happen is you'll have all sorts of questions as a result of this webinar. But we don't really have a lot of time to go into too much detail. So please send your questions to us to let you know who we are, who's been involved today, Kate and I. There are all our details. This will come when we send out the recording, because this webinar is being recorded. So please take those down, or you'll have them from the invitations that we've sent out, so that you can let us know what your particular issues are. There will be lots, we know that. And we've just tipped the ice, we've just gone through the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more that we could tell you, but it gets too complicated. And so that's what it is. And that's the end of this webinar. Before I bang on anymore and either lose my voice or bore you entirely. So there is another one coming up, because this is a series, remember, and we're now going to move off estates, wills, trusts, generations, although the next one has some kind of relevance. And we're going to move on to the investment side. So let us know, please, what you want to know on the investment side. Do you want us to tell you how retirement annuities work? Do you want to understand what a living annuity is? What is an endowment? Because you'll hear these things bandied around all the time, and it's quite useful to have some inside knowledge. But the next webinar, I need a drum roll here, but I haven't got one, is our third webinar on the 17th of August. It's going to be run by one of our portfolio managers, Eric Lapperman, who is excellent at what he does. And he is going to talk on investing like a millennial. Millennials are interesting because they're going to inherit a huge amount of the wealth that is going to be left by the baby boomers. It's something like 68 trillion rand. So it's important to understand how they invest. And hopefully there are a lot of millennials watching. So that's the end. Thank you very, very much for listening to us. I hope it was of value. And please send through all your queries and questions, and let us know if you'd like to set up a Zoom or a Teams, or probably not in person just at the moment. And thank you so much for listening.